Hi, this is Olivia. Today I'm going to show you a really easy way to validate dates in a user form before they're entered into the spreadsheet. For example, here if we were to enter a date, just a normal date, everything works fine. The user at this point can continue entering, can tab out of date and continue entering data into this form before hitting submit. However, if they enter something incorrectly, like this for example, and they tab out of the date text box, we're going to get a couple of flags letting them know that things don't look exactly right. So the date label, for example, will change to red. The text here in the text box will also appear red. And we also get an invalid entry message box at the bottom of the user form. Another thing I'm going to show you is how to quickly format your date. You know, everybody sort of has a particular way of entering data in date data into their user form. For example, some people use dashes. Some people enter month, day, year, year. But I like to see dates written as month, month slash, day, day slash, year, 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 year. So no matter how your user enters the data, once they tab out, it's going to automatically update it and display it in this format, which is the format I like to see in my spreadsheets. Okay, so before we get started looking at the code, I want to just quickly walk through how I set up my user form here. Okay, so I have 1, 2, 3, 4 labels. These three are black, this one's red. So it's important that this is red. I'm going to talk about that a little bit more in a little bit. But right now we have 3 labels. I tried to keep the names very simple. So this is just called date label. Then we have amount label, payee label, and the error message label. And then we have 3 text boxes. This one's just called date text box, amount text box, pay text box, and 1 button that I've called submit button. And again, this label right here, I preset the 4 color to red, and I gave it an invalid an default caption called invalid entry. And notice that the label already appears on the form from the start. So this is important because when we look at the code, when we initialize it, because that label already appears on the user form, we want to make sure that when we initialize our form using user form underscore initialize, we want to make sure that we set that label, the visibility of that label, to false. So here, you know, just upon initializing, we have me dot error message label dot visible equals false. Okay, let me go ahead and close these, and we'll start talking about the code. Okay, with text boxes, there are a number of different events that you can use with them. And over here in the upper right hand corner is a drop down menu where you can take a look at the different events that you have available to you with text boxes. I prefer the after update event. Now with after update, the way it works is the user will go in and make changes in the text box. Maybe they're adding information or changing information that's already in there. And as soon as they tab out or they mouse out, then these lines of code will be executed. Okay, so with this function, I have 1 variable. It's called date entered, and it's going to contain a date value. So basically what's going to happen is the user is going to enter a date into the date text box, which of course is just a string of characters. Then we're going to take that string of characters and we're going to try and convert it to a date value, and it will be stored here in the date entered variable. Now I have an if statement. with two possible scenarios. The first is what happens when the user enters data into the date text box. So if me.date text box.value not equal to nothing, in other words, if there's actual content in the text box and the user tabs out, this is what will happen. Otherwise, or else, the user might clear the text box altogether and then tab out. In that scenario, this is what's going to happen. And so we're going to go all through it line by line. Okay, we start off by setting date entered to -1. Now, -1, when date entered equals -1, that's going to be a signal that there is a bad date entry by the user. In other words, we can't take the string of characters the user entered into the text box and we cannot convert them into a date. Now, that can happen for a number of reasons. Maybe the user entered an invalid date like February 29th on a non-leap year, or maybe they accidentally entered some extra characters. But for whatever reason, if we cannot convert the string of characters that the user has entered into the text box, if we cannot convert that to a date, then date entered will be equal to -1. Next, we have on error resume next. What this line of code does is it will disable any system error messages. So if there is a critical error, something that's going to halt the program, this line of code says ignore it, skip past it, and move on to the next thing. And that becomes important here in this line of code. So here we're actually taking what the user has entered into the text box, me.date textbox.value, and we're passing it to the CDate function. It's a built-in function. Now, if the user has entered a good date in whatever format that they entered it in, but if they've entered a good date, CDate will convert it and it will assign it to the date entered variable. However, if they enter a bad date, it's going to throw an error. But we've already handled that error with this line of code, on error resume next. So if the user does enter a bad date, it's going to skip past it and it's going to move on to this line of code. And in skipping past it, remember that date entered is already set to -1, so date entered will continue to be -1. Now, on error go to 0, what that does is basically just the opposite of on error resume next. On error resume next disables system error messages. On error go to 0 will enable them again. Okay, next we have an if statement. So we have if date entered not equal to -1, which means that it's a valid entry, and then we have the opposite of that, so if it's an invalid entry, and what we do in both scenarios. So if it's not equal to -1, meaning we actually have a date in our date entered variable, we're going to do a little toggle thing here where we switch between red and black depending on whether or not we switch the color of our labels to red or black, depending on whether or not it's a valid entry or not. So if it's a valid entry, then obviously we want our labels to be black. So we say me.date label.forecolor equals RGB 000, which is black. We also me.take date textbox.forecolor, so the text inside the text box, that we also set to black. And if we do have a valid entry, as I mentioned earlier, I prefer the formatting of month, month, day, day, year, 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 year using slashes. So no matter how your user might enter a date, I always like to just replace it with the formatting that I like. So that's what this line of code does here, is it sets the value of the text box, like the actual value of the text box, we're setting it to this formatting. We use the format function. With format function, there's two parameters. The first is what we're formatting, and the second parameter is the formatting that we like. So we're taking what's entered currently into the text box, me.date textbox.value, and we're changing it to month slash day slash year. And so no matter what the user has entered, it's going to be replaced by this. Now, down here, we handle our error message label. So if you remember from the beginning of the video, whenever there's an error on the page, we have the error message label at the bottom of the form that says invalid entry. Now that we're also going to toggle off and on as well, but that gets a little bit more complicated, so I'm actually going to skip this just for a moment, and then I'm going to come back to it. And then I'm going to come down here where if there's an invalid entry, what we do. So just as we did before, by changing the label to black, we're going to change it to red with invalid entry. So me.datelabel.forecolor equals red, RGB 25500. The date text box forecolor, we're also going to change to red. So again, the text inside of the text box. And then when there's an error, we obviously are going to set the error message label. We're going to set the visibility to true. So let's see this in action. Okay, let's say the user enters a bad date, by accident. They enter something strange like that. And then they tab out. So this is that second scenario where the date label is changed to red, the forecolor of the text box is changed to red, and we make our error message label visible. Now they come in and they fix it, right? And it doesn't matter actually what formatting they use, because as soon as they tab out or they mouse out, it's going to do a number of things. Number one, it's going to change the forecolor of the date label back to black. It's going to change the forecolor of our text box back to black. Our error message label disappeared, and the formatting changed to month slash day slash year. Okay, let's say we have this invalid entry, right? Now, I mentioned just a minute ago that whether or not this shows on the user form, that it could be a little bit complicated. And the reason why it's complicated is because a lot of times when we have error messages like this, they cover the whole user form. So let's say we have some kind of data validation set for this amount column as well, right? Now we have two errors on the page. So if I come in here and I actually fix this date and I tab out, I don't want this to go away yet, right? Because I still have an error with the amount text box. So that's why it gets a little bit complicated. We don't want to just say once we fix the date, we get rid of that error message label at the bottom of the screen. We want to make sure that everything's good all throughout the user form. And so let's go back and I'll show you how I did that. Okay, so this is that scenario I just went over. The user entered a valid date. So our date entered is not equal to -1. We changed the date label to black, the text box to black, we formatted the entry, and then we get to this portion where we have to determine whether or not we want to make the error message label visible or make it invisible. And so what I did was I created a function called scan for error labels that's going to scan the user form to look for red labels, because remember, red label indicates that there's an error on the user form. So scan for error labels is going to return a Boolean value. So it will return false if no errors are detected on the user form, and it will return true if there are errors detected on the user form. So before I get started, I just want to mention that remember that the error message label that appears at the bottom of the user form is red by default. So there will always be at least one red label on the user form. So take that into account as we go through this function line by line. Okay, so here's our first variable. It's called control in form, and it's a control variable. And then I have count error labels, which is going to contain an integer. And count error labels, I'm just going to set to 0 by default, or just to get things started. Next, we have a loop. And so let's read through it. Basically, what this loop is going to do is it's going to go through every single control on the user form. It's going to then identify the labels. And if it is a label, it's going to check to see that if it's red. And if it is red, then it's going to increment the count error labels variable by 1. So let's look at the code then. So for each control in form in me.controls, which is basically saying for every control on the form, if the type name control in form equals label, so if it's a label, check to see if it's red. If control in form.forColor equals RGB 25500, then it is red. So if it is red, count error labels equals count error labels plus 1. And so it's going to continue to loop through all the controls in the form and the user form. It's going to check to see if there are labels. If it is, it's going to check to see if it's red. If it is, count error labels is incremented by 1. Now we come down here to the bottom. So if count error labels equals 1, then scan for labels equals false. So remember, as I mentioned, we will always have at least one because the error message label at the bottom of the user form is set to red by default. So if it equals 1, that means everything else is good. So if count error labels equals 1, then scan for error labels. And remember, scan for error labels is just the name of our function that returns a Boolean value. So if count error labels equals 1, scan for error labels equals false. Else, scan for error labels equals true. And so it's going to return that Boolean value back to this location in our date text box after update sub. So we say if scan for error labels equals false, then error message label.visible equals false. So if it's false, that means there are no errors on the user form. Go ahead and remove the error message label from the bottom of the user form. However, if it's true, then error message label.visible is true. And so that's how we're able to have more than one error on a user form, fix one of the errors, and not get rid of this error message label at the bottom of the user form. Okay, so that pretty much covers everything that could possibly happen when a user enters data into the date text box field. But what happens if data is already in the field and now the user goes in and removes it? So when the user removes data, we want to make sure that we reset everything back to its original settings, just like we did there. Even though we had our error labels showing, once the user deletes everything, the date goes back to black. The error message in this case, because there are no other errors, on the user form, that also went away, and then our font inside of the text box also get reset to black. Okay, so all the code that handles that scenario that I just showed you, you've already seen it. This should look very familiar to you. So here we are in the code. We're at our else statement, where the user clears the text box. So we set the date label for color to black. We set the date text box for color to black. And then we run another scan for error labels. And if it's false, then the error message label, the visibility, is set to false. Otherwise, it's set to true. And that's everything. Okay, thank you very much.